Good day. I have with me Chris Hatting. He's the Deputy Head of Campaigns at the Institute for Race Relations, the IRR as we know it. And we're talking to Chris about the war in Ukraine, the conflict there between Russia and Ukraine. And Chris, I think the burning question for a lot of South Africans is, why should we worry about a war in Ukraine? How is it possible for that war to affect us in South Africa?
Thanks, Isaac. Thanks very much for having me on and for the opportunity. Always great to get to talk to you and South Africans about things going on in the world. I suppose the biggest immediate threat is for South African exporters. So the Eurozone is South Africa's biggest export market. We export a lot of fruit and products of that nature. So if there's conflict between any European nations, that increases the possibility that our exporters won't be able to export to those markets. So if there's war, for example, it's simply a case of those consumers will struggle to give us the necessary money to buy our products. That's a big issue. Secondly, global supply chains. So those supply chains have been affected a lot the last 2 years, of course, by COVID-19, by lockdowns and stuff, and similar sort of, what are we going to call it, gum in the works, in the machinery, making things difficult. So now with sanctions and trade embargoes on Russia, it'll be more difficult for goods to move around the Northern Hemisphere, and especially sort of Eurasia, Russia and China specifically. That'll also affect the movement of goods from South Africa and where we can export things to. It'll also make it more difficult for things to get to South Africa, and simply renders it more difficult for trade to flow around the world. And then thirdly, Ukraine and Russia export a lot of grain, especially, and other commodities and raw materials to African countries. So that'll affect the trade that we can do with our neighbors. We aren't that reliant on them massively. So if there is a big disruption, we should be able to survive. But then again, you look at the South African context, let's say we get expropriation without compensation, and that affects our own capacity to manufacture and to do farming. Then where is our grain supply going to come from? Is it not then going to be more reliant on Russia, for example? So we need to keep in mind, we still have these policies on the cards in South Africa. It all shakes down to possibly very negatively. And then the final biggest overriding point that I should mention is, of course, with oil prices. So the price of a barrel of oil, I think this morning might be over 140 at this point. I'm speaking under correction, but the morning of 7 March. So if oil becomes more expensive, of course, fuel is more expensive. The petrol price is now at 21 Rand in South Africa. I saw over the weekend, someone thought, an expert predicted it might reach 40 Rand at some point this year, in which case, I don't know what we're going to do. We might need to jump on our bicycles or skateboards or something like that. But with the increase in the fuel price, it becomes more difficult for truckers, of course, to transport goods, for people to manufacture things. And that increases inflation, and that renders it more difficult for consumers to buy goods. The Rand that they have in their pockets doesn't go as far as it used to. It loses worth when there's more inflation, and then they can't buy goods and products as well as they could before. So all of this points to very high risks for South African consumers. And I guess we can only hope that global forces don't play out in such a way that emerging market economies such as South Africa suffer the most again.
And with the South African economy in the state as it is, I suppose it makes it even much more difficult.
Right. A few weeks ago in his budget speech, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana, he said that Treasury forecasts that South Africa's growth will average 1.8% for the next 3 years. Now, to make progress in addressing a 46% unemployment rate, you need quite a bit more than 1.8% growth. You need maybe on average between 6 and 8% growth for the next 5 years. So if global forces and events work in such a way that investment retreats from emerging market economies, maybe now European countries will look at their own economies more than investing in South Africa. Again, we lose out from that, and that means our growth rate will be even lower in the short to medium term. So I think you're absolutely right to point that out, and you wonder where the sort of job opportunities and things are going to come from, where they're going to come from without the necessary level of investment. So we need to really hope that this conflict, I mean, of course, we need to hope that it'll end quickly just because of the loss of life in Ukraine, but we should also hope that it ends quickly because it'll then again allow investment and trade to flow around the world and hopefully to places like South Africa.